Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge. Today we're diving into a really transformative chapter from Freud and Beyond, a history of modern psychoanalytic thought by Mitchell and Black. This one's all about shaking up some foundational ideas in psychoanalysis, especially how we think about, well, the very beginnings of ourselves.
Indeed. We'll be exploring the British Object Relations School,
Yeah.
specifically focusing on the really groundbreaking work of W.R.D. Fairbairn and D.W. Winnicott, and a few other key figures, too. Our mission today really is to get a handle on how these thinkers shifted the focus, away from just internal drives towards the absolutely crucial role of early relationships in shaping who we are. So get ready to maybe reconsider what you thought you knew about the human infant.
It's a huge contrast to Freud's ideas, isn't it? Because for Freud, often the infant was seen as, well, almost this bestial creature, kind of fundamentally at odds with the world around it, driven by pleasure, needing to be, socialized. But for the object relations folks, the story is much more about relationships, right from the get-go. We're talking about a baby that's actually wired for connection.
Right. And to set the stage, maybe we should quickly touch on Melanie Klein. She sort of bridged the gap from Freud. She introduced this idea of built-in human objects. Basically, her proposal was that infants aren't just reacting passively, they're born with these innate sort of preformed fantasies or expectations, like about the breast. So the baby instinctively knows about it, even before actually experiencing it. It's a human infant from the start, not some blank slate.
Yeah, but Klein's baby wasn't exactly living in paradise, was it? For her, infancy was packed with what she called psychotic anxieties, intense fears, persecution, annihilation, and this idea of overwhelming constitutional aggression, innate aggression. So, in her view, sanity isn't a given. It's something you have to achieve fighting against this terrifying internal world, not the peaceful beginning we might like to imagine.
Exactly. And that leads us to a really crucial moment. The split in the British Psychoanalytic Society back in the early 1940s. Some stuck with Klein, some with traditional Freudian ideas, but this independent group emerged. And that included Fairbairn and Winnicott. What set them apart? Well, they kind of accepted Klein's idea that the infant is wired for interaction. But, and this is key, they rejected her concept of constitutional aggression. This idea that aggression is this massive, built-in force from birth.
Right. Instead, they suggested an infant wired for, let's say, harmonious interaction, a kind of innate desire for connection. But, and this is the crucial part, this wiring could be disrupted, thwarted by, well, inadequate parenting. Like John Bowlby, another member of the group, famously said, "But there is such a thing as a bad mother." For them, that statement really signaled a profound shift, moving the focus from the baby's innate drives to the absolute importance of the early environment. Okay, so with this different view of the infant, Fairbairn tackled one of psychoanalysis's big puzzles, something Freud really struggled with, the repetition compulsion. If we're wired for connection, why do we keep getting stuck in these painful patterns, making ourselves unhappy again and again, even when we consciously want to avoid pain? Freud found that hard to square with his pleasure principle. How did Fairbairn approach it?
Well, Fairbairn's core idea offers a completely different way of looking at it. He said libido is not pleasure-seeking, fundamentally, but object-seeking. This just radically redefines our motivation. It means our basic drive isn't just about reducing tension or using people to get gratification. It's about connection with others as an end in itself. That's the goal. And this gives us a much more compelling explanation for why our emotional lives get stuck in these painful loops. He argued our libido, our core energy, is inherently adhesive. It sticks to relationships, even bad ones, because the bond itself is the main thing.
Wow, that is a profound shift. It suggests we're fundamentally relational beings, not just pleasure seekers. So for Fairbairn, pleasure becomes a way of connecting, maybe, not the ultimate aim. If parents offer pleasurable interactions, the child learns that pleasure is a good way to connect. And here's that really startling insight you mentioned. His work with abused children. They didn't necessarily avoid the abusive parents. Instead, they sometimes came to seek pain as a form of connection, because maybe that was the only connection available, like those ducklings imprinting, right? Whatever's there becomes the object, creating this powerful bond that shapes everything later on.
Exactly. And we can see this really clearly in the case of Sam. He kept finding himself drawn to relationships with very depressed women, and he was completely baffled by it. Why did this keep happening? Well, Sam came from a family where both parents felt quite resigned, crushed by life. They saw life as basically miserable. And in analysis, Sam started to realize how much depression had become a kind of family ideology for him. This unconscious belief that life is miserable and real deep connection only happens through shared unhappiness. Laughing felt superficial, but crying together felt intimate. So for Fairbairn, these early relationship patterns, these early objects, become the prototypes for all later connections.
It's incredible how deeply those blueprints get etched in, isn't it? Almost like a hidden program running our adult lives. So if those positive, affirming interactions aren't there, what happens then? This brings us to Fairbairn's idea of the world of internal object relations. He borrowed Klein's idea of internal objects, but gave them a really different spin. For Klein, they were kind of inevitable fantasies, but for Fairbairn, they were more like compensatory substitutes, a kind of pathological turning away from the outside world. When a child's dependency needs aren't met properly, the child creates these private internal presences to fill that gap.
Yeah, and the case of Charles illustrates this really well. He was a middle-aged man who came to analysis for depression and withdrawal. His father was distant, demanding. His mother was physically there but emotionally unavailable, always putting on a sunny face, never showing her own sadness. Charles remembered secretly listening to his father playing these sad ballads on the piano and feeling this rare, deep connection in that shared melancholy. And his dream imagery of a jellyfish man, collapsed, sad, helpless, spineless, helps us understand how he internalized those distant parts of his parents. Paradoxically, he felt most connected to them through his own sadness and despair. His depressions were like these precious, unintegrated bits of loving connection.
Fairbairn also had a really different take on repression, didn't he? For Freud, repression was mostly about pushing down traumatic memories or forbidden impulses, like, Oedipal desires.
Right, the whole Oedipus complex, those early feelings towards parents, rivalries, things like that.
But for Fairbairn, the core of what gets repressed isn't just impulses or memories, it's relationships themselves. These dangerous connections to the parts of our parents we couldn't really reach or integrate. Memories and impulses might get repressed too, sure, but only because they represent or threaten to expose these dangerous internal relationship ties. So for Fairbairn, both what's repressed and the act of repressing are fundamentally about these internal relationships.
Yeah, that's a key difference, and we can see this in the story of Zachary. He really struggled with romantic commitment after his father was kicked out of the family for infidelity. Zachary had these incredibly idealistic ideas about love, but he was terrified of actually committing. His internal conflict wasn't just about, say, sexual urges. It was about his hidden, dangerous connection, his libidinal attachment to his father, a part of himself he both feared and longed to be
Yeah.
sexual, maybe irresponsible. And this attachment threatened his conscious sense of self, which was built around his relationship with his mother and stepfather and his need to be liked by them.
Okay, so our internal world gets populated with these compensatory objects, these relationship fragments. How does the self manage all that? This leads to Fairbairn's idea of the splitting of the ego, right? Which he saw as kind of a normal, sometimes problematic response to imperfect parenting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Parents are never perfect. They're sometimes wonderful, sometimes disappointing, sometimes frustrating. Fairbairn suggested our minds split these experiences to cope. We internalize difficult aspects of our parents, maybe their depression, their withdrawal, their anger, partly to feel connected to them, even the difficult parts. This internalizes the parent and creates a split within us. Part of the self stays focused on real parents, looking for real responses, but another part turns inward towards these sort of illusory internal objects.
And didn't he talk about splitting the object itself?
Yes. He suggested we split the internal object into an exciting object, representing the alluring, promising, but maybe tantalizingly unavailable aspects of the parent, and a rejecting object, representing the frustrating, disappointing, rejecting aspects. And these internal object splits then create corresponding splits within our own ego, our sense of self. A libidinal ego attached to the exciting object, full of perpetual longing and hope, and paradoxically an anti-libidinal ego linked to the rejecting object, filled with anger and hate, often despising that very hopeful, vulnerable part of the self, almost like a defense against more hurt.
That sounds like a pretty intense internal drama. Let's look at the case of Jane. She had severe anxiety, depression, and bulimia. You mentioned after a really good session where she felt hopeful, she quickly became fearful, and then she went out, binged on cookies, and purged.
Right. That sequence, hope, followed by fear, followed by the binge purge, really shows this internal conflict. It reveals an internal warden part of her anti-libidinal ego, you could say. This part hates hope, convinced it only ever leads to disappointment and pain. So this warden keeps her safe, but locked in this prison of old, painful patterns. It cuts her off from real human connection, including the potential connection with the analyst as someone new. The prison is her internal object world, the prisoner is that hopeful libidinal ego, and the warden is the anti-libidinal ego, keeping it all locked down.
Okay, so if our internal world is structured like this, by these early relationships and the resulting splits, how does change happen in analysis, according to Fairbairn? It can't just be about insight, like Freud might have emphasized.
No, definitely not just insight. For Fairbairn, insight alone isn't enough, because the neurosis, the pattern, is the only way the person knows how to connect. They feel connected to others, internally and externally, only through these painful states or self-defeating ways of relating. To give those up feels terrifying, like total isolation, like losing the only connection they have, however bad it feels.
That makes a lot of sense. So what is the key then?
For Fairbairn, change isn't about giving up pleasure or just understanding why the old ways don't work. It's about fostering a changed capacity for relatedness. The patient needs to experience the analyst as a genuinely new kind of object, someone who doesn't fit the old molds, the old transferential patterns, those unconscious ways we replay past relationships in the present.
Right, so the relationship itself becomes the vehicle for change.
Precisely. Think about Paula. Her family background led her to use relationships for a kind of ritual humiliation. She found that when she started earning more money, becoming more competent, she actually got depressed, feeling isolated by her success. That moment of standing outside old patterns helped her see how they kept her safe, but also trapped. Towards the end of her analysis, she used that amazing image, like a jungle cat in a cage whose door stood open. She could finally sense the possibility of stepping out once she believed there was solid ground outside the cage, not just an abyss. The analytic relationship provided that new kind of object, that experience of being related to differently, which gave her the courage to step out.
So Fairbairn really shows how deeply entrenched these early relational patterns can be, even defining what connection itself means to us. But how early does this all start? And how do we develop a truly authentic sense of self? To explore that, we need to turn to another giant of the independent group, D.W. Winnicott. He was a pediatrician first, which gave him a really unique perspective, right? He actually observed mothers and babies directly.
Yes, very much so. He brought this incredibly sensitive, hands-on clinical wisdom. He was deeply interested in the quality of the mother's responsiveness, the subjective experience, not just whether basic needs were met.
And he came up with the concept of false self-disorder. What was that about?
He was fascinated by patients who seemed to function perfectly well on the outside, successful, capable, but inwardly they felt unreal, like they weren't a real person. They lacked a sense of inner substance or personal meaning. And he traced the origins of this feeling way back to very early, subtle issues in the mother-infant interaction. He even called false self-disorders environmental deficiency diseases because he saw them arising from a lack in that early relational environment.
So the false self develops when the baby has to adapt too early, too much to the outside world at the cost of its own, what do you call it, going on being?
Exactly, going on being. That's Winnicott's term for the baby's fundamental sense of just existing. It's this comfortable, almost fluid, unintegrated state, like drifting, where little needs or gestures just emerge spontaneously, and if they're met, they kind of melt back into that flow. He thought experiencing this state was absolutely crucial for developing a genuine, authentic self, rather than seeing it as some terrifying fragmentation we need to overcome quickly.
Okay, so how does that genuine self get nurtured? This is where the good enough mother comes in, right?
Yes, the good enough mother and her temporary state of primary maternal preoccupation. Winnicott described this as kind of temporary, almost constructive madness. Especially late in pregnancy, in the first few months after birth, the mother intuitively tunes out her own needs, her own subjectivity, to create what he called a holding environment for the baby. She adapts everything, her movements, her schedule, her whole being, almost perfectly to the baby's emerging needs and gestures.
And this holding environment creates subjective omnipotence. The baby feels like its wishes create reality.
That's the idea. The good enough mother essentially brings the world to the baby without delay. She anticipates or meets the need just as it arises. So the baby gets this powerful, necessary illusion that its wish made the breast appear, or its cry created the warmth and comfort.
A magical phase, but temporary.
Temporary, yes. And here's the crucial Winnicott twist. The good enough mother eventually starts a slow, incremental failure. She gradually misses a beat, then maybe two. She doesn't adapt quite so perfectly. And this isn't a bad thing. For Winnicott, it's absolutely essential because it's in that growing gap between the wish and its satisfaction that the child slowly, gently begins to realize, oh, I'm dependent. My wishes don't control everything. There's an outside world with its own reality, other people. This gradual disillusionment is vital for healthy development.
This makes me think of his idea of transitional objects like the teddy bear or security blanket. It's not just about coping with separation, is it?
No, not just separation. For Winnicott, the transitional object occupies this amazing paradoxical space between the baby's subjective creation, I made this, and objective reality. It was already there. It's neither fully internal nor fully external. It exists in this intermediate area of experience. And he thought this capacity for transitional experience, for playing in this ambiguous space, is fundamental for mental health, for creativity, for culture. It bridges our inner and outer worlds.
And Winnicott also talked about object usage, bringing aggression back into the picture, but differently from Klein.
Yes, differently. In that early stage of subjective omnipotence, the baby relates to the mother as a purely subjective object, someone they feel they've created. And they use her ruthlessly, he said. They kind of project onto her, exploit her, even symbolically destroy her in their fantasy by totally appropriating her. The crucial thing is the mother's ability to survive this symbolic destruction without retaliating or withdrawing. Her survival, cycle after cycle, is what gradually establishes her as a real external other existing in her own right, outside the baby's omnipotent control. And Winnicott believed this ability to destroy and have the other survive is what makes mature adult love possible, where we can really surrender to intimacy without unconsciously fearing we'll annihilate the other person.
So what happens if the mothering isn't good enough, if there's too much impingement, as he called it?
Impingement is when the environment intrudes too much, or is unresponsive. The baby has to react rather than just be. Development can effectively stop. The true self goes into hiding. We see this vividly in the story of Peter, that mechanical engineer who repaired complex machines. He sought out gliding and scuba diving, searching for that feeling of being held, supported, able to drift without having to be constantly vigilant, the holding environment he missed as a child.
And his anxiety when the tow rope disconnected or the seabed dropped away.
Exactly. It powerfully symbolized his deep terror of dependence, born from having to be prematurely watchful and self-reliant as a kid. He often had to mediate his parents' fights and remember his memory of the cardboard kid's birthday party.
Right, having to invite strangers instead of his own friends.
That really shows the roots of his false self, having to comply, to perform, to manage the external world at the expense of his own genuine feelings and desires.
And what about Doris, the young woman who felt removed from her own experience?
Yes, she compulsively created these false self-experiences to meet what she thought others needed. And she had that recurring dream about a wax baby head that was going to melt.
Chilling image.
It really captures how, when the holding isn't adequate, the child might disconnect mind from body, shaping experience around what's provided externally, unable to explore their own subjectivity. The true self, like the wax head, feels fragile, unreal, potentially dissolving, waiting for a safer environment.
So in analysis, Winnicott saw the analyst's role as mirroring that good enough mother.
In a way, yes. Suspending their own subjectivity, their own needs and theories, to provide a reliable, responsive, holding environment. A space where the patient can simply be, where spontaneous gestures and feelings can emerge without demand. He even describes sometimes opening his office door just as a patient raised their hand to knock, creating that feeling for the patient that their witch had perhaps created the analyst's appearance. It's all about facilitating the experience of self in relation to the other, allowing the patient to rediscover their capacity for personal meaning and spontaneity, maybe for the first time.
Fairbairn and Winnicott were clearly central figures, but the independent group had other important voices too, right? Like Balint, Bowlby, Guntrip.
Absolutely. They all built on this relational shift. Michael Balint, for instance, influenced by Ferenczi, talked about primary object love. This idea that early deprivation can create a basic fault, a kind of fundamental crack or fragmentation deep within the self, more profound than neurosis. And he saw patients in analysis seeking healing through benign regression, not just to satisfy old drives, but to find a new beginning, to finally experience that missed unconditional acceptance.
And then John Bowlby and attachment theory, which has become so influential.
Hugely influential. Bowlby took the relational ideas of the independents and grounded them firmly in 20th century Darwinian thinking. He argued that the child's powerful tie to the mother isn't just about food or needs, it's an instinctual behavioral system designed for survival, an evolutionary mechanism to ensure proximity to the caregiver for protection. This totally revolutionized how we understood love and bonding, showing that the need for attachment is primary and innate, challenging Freud's view, and really paving the way for modern developmental psychology.
And finally, Harry Guntrip.
Guntrip was actually analyzed by both Fairbairn and Winnicott, so he was uniquely positioned to integrate their ideas. He developed the concept of the regressed ego, this deeply hidden, withdrawn part of the self that is almost given up on seeking objects externally, reflecting a profound longing for a completely new start in a safe, maternal-like environment. He saw psychoanalysis, essentially, as a kind of replacement therapy, where the analyst provides the missing relational medium needed for a healthy self to finally take root and grow. You can see the links to the popular idea of the inner child here.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive really shows how the British Object Relations School, especially Fairbairn and Winnicott, fundamentally reoriented psychoanalysis, moving beyond Freud's drive theory to emphasize our inherent need for relationship right from infancy. And the massive impact of that early environment, the holding, the failures, the kinds of connection offered on shaping our inner world, our sense of self, and the patterns we carry into all our later relationships.
Exactly. They gave us a new language to talk about that internal struggle between hope and despair,
Yeah.
longing and defense, and the deep, enduring human craving for authentic connection and feeling real.
It's a really profound shift, isn't it? From seeing development as a solo journey of managing impulses to understanding it as deeply, fundamentally relational. So, what does this all mean for you listening? Well, if our deepest drive is for connection, and if our early experiences shape the forms that connection takes for us, even the painful ones, then maybe that chemistry you feel in relationships, good or bad, isn't just random. It might be your unconscious trying to recreate those familiar, deeply etched patterns.
Yeah, and the crucial insight there is that the pain or the difficulty isn't meaningless. It's often, as Fairbairn saw it, a distorted attempt to connect in the only way that feels possible or familiar. Recognizing that might be the very first step toward finding new ways, building new kinds of connections.
Which leads to a final thought. If our internal worlds are shaped by these early relationships, these internal objects, splits, and defenses, and if finding a new kind of relatedness is the key to change, then how might you start to gently identify, maybe even challenge, the wardens and the jungle cats inside yourself? Those parts keeping you safe, perhaps, but also stuck in the cage. How might you begin to open the door, just a crack, to new possibilities for connection, both with yourself and with others?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of the British Object Relations School. We really hope this exploration has sparked some insights and maybe offered a fresh lens on the complex, sometimes puzzling, but ultimately beautiful ways we connect.
We're grateful you've spent this time learning with us.